My name is Ray Kowalczyk, and I've been a vegan activist longer than I've been vegan. How's that work? And I'm actually based in Toronto. Eganville is a bit west of Ottawa. There are people sitting outside of a storefront who are probably wondering why people are taking pictures in front of their sign and probably decided we're fans of Avril Lavigne, whose hometown is Napanee, Ontario. So I've been fortunate to have excellent vegan mentors in my life. My wife, Kelly, the divine feminine moral leader of our family, who even before she became a chef, showed me that I could still be a vegan with an appetite. As a sly part of my vegan conditioning, she lured me to a vegan fundraiser dinner where I met Dr. Anita Kreinz. Involvement in the animal save movement taught me that I would stop wanting the flesh and secretions of animals just by seeing them, the animals themselves, and seeing them off at the gates of the slaughterhouse before they go from being sentient and suffering to shrink wrapped in styrofoam. Kelly also lured me to a vegan bake sale, after which was a public screening of Cowspiracy. I was deeply impacted and should have made me go vegan on the spot. Instead, I wanted to try to debunk the documentary, and I started researching, which probably had even more of an effect because a lot of the politics behind it made me outraged to find out how much more truths have been suppressed from us. So it's become a life-changing moment that I've embraced and pivoted and steered into it. That day, I decided I was going to stop giving to Greenpeace. I was an armchair activist who just kind of gave money to Greenpeace and hoped they'd save the whales or save some trees or something. My activism's already a bit backwards. I actually hadn't watched An Inconvenient Truth until I watched Cowspiracy. So later that summer, I was trained by Al Gore to give his slideshow presentation with Anita Kreinz. As you can see in the background, we got our certificates, even though we disrupted the presentation and gave Al Gore a copy of Cowspiracy, courtesy of our friend Jenny McQueen. There was also a large march organized by 350.org. So I marched with Jane Fonda and David Suzuki and Naomi Klein and thousands of others in this march for jobs, justice, and the environment. My question was, why jobs? Why is jobs lead the list and our environment is last? And they said, because we can't have people saying that the environment is going to cost jobs. So we're going to prove that environmental action is legitimate because it creates jobs. Which didn't bother me as much at the time, but as time went on, I just kind of associate this with solutions that grow the economy and create more jobs is more important than actually saving the environment. And Cowspiracy and Climate Reality led me to this guy. Cowspiracy was presented at European Parliament, and Celeste Rowe was one of the presenters there. I discovered he was a climate reality trainer who had dramatically crossed the floor when animal agriculture wasn't being addressed. But my exposure to Dr. Rao's systemic view of oppression of animals and the environment, once you honestly take off the meat goggles, you can't unsee it. This was critical for my own vegan transformation because I couldn't see why I had to make sacrifices of convenience when the world isn't going to change. And then once you discover that the world is going to change and it has to change, something truly obsolete that needs to be replaced, why wouldn't you steer into it and be part of that change? Veganism is nothing new since Pythagoras, the first Jain temples. We've known there's a better way. Why not get in early now that it's kind of a privilege to be alive at this time when those changes are finally going to be happening? Good news, Pythagoras. We're getting there. Well, I'm talking about hot stock tips. Beyond Meat just partnered with PepsiCo. So for better or for worse, causing their stock to go up 30%. I don't think that's how the world's going to change, but it's definitely an encouraging sign that it'll be easier for us to do so. So this presentation is called, What If It Was a Vegan Donut? And you notice it's an acronym. Vegan stands for Vitally Engaged Guardians of Animals and Nature. And the it in question is donut economics, an emerging concept popular amongst change makers. If you're familiar with donut economics, you'll recognize this radial graph. Why they made it a green donut, we may never know. I guess they were feeling environmental. The system already combines a few pre-existing concepts. The inside of the donut, more or less, correlates to the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations. We have some opinions on those. Climate Healers in particular wants to solve number 2 and see what sort of effect it has on all the other ones. What if we solved world hunger, right? What sort of side benefits would come along with that? The Food Healers Initiative is promoting a cultural shift to empower each community to feed itself plant-based nutrition. And we hope this idea goes viral. Is that a bad time during a lockdown to use the word viral? A good viral. On the other hand, SDG number 8, we've identified as a Trojan horse, inserted here by business interests that want to promote the idea that our planet can withstand infinite growth. It's right there on the icon graph. They think that everything is an upward graph. We can't meet any of the SDGs pretending the land, sky, and sea are infinite resources and dumping ground for our pollution. Most of those SDGs relate to the inside of the donut. There's a few that are relative to the environment in general, but I challenge those notions because when you look into them, they define fish as fisheries or fish stocks. This is the language that they use. So in other words, it's still a very anthropocentric point of view, and it's not saving nature as much as it is preserving the resources so we can continue to use nature and exploit it. Life on land, the language is a lot better. It says that restoring biodiversity is the number one job, but I'm not sure if it's clear that they understand that animal agriculture is the leading cause of the mass extinction of species. When it comes to preventing zoonotic pandemics, this is what the website has to say. COVID-19 implications, wildlife trafficking disrupts ecosystems and contributes to the spread of infectious disease. True, but their solution is pangolins? They seized 370,000 pangolins as a solution to zoonotic diseases, when there's obviously solutions in front of us in the form of animal agriculture. Our friend Claire Smith, who runs Beyond Animals platform and has launched the Vegan Stock Market Index, has campaigned to add an 18th SDG, zero animal exploitation. Just as the SDGs establish a baseline for governments to consider all human lives important, eliminating the oppression of animals will set a proper path to not just stop extinction, but restore biodiversity. Dozens of the world's top natural scientists have identified 9 planetary boundaries. This is another radial graph that corresponds to the outer limits of the donut. You'll see the same categories around the outside of the donut model, just not in the same places. These boundaries remind us of the ways that humanity can and do make ourselves the biggest nuisance in the, quote, Anthropocene, the age in which the impact of our species is bigger than forces of nature, like the sun. In most illustrations of the Anthropocene, humanity are the bad guys. I'd love to explain this graph in painful detail at some point, or better yet, we could get Dr. William Redeman to explain it because it's his chart. Maybe we'll get him to participate in future convergences. This yellow in the graph is humanity slashing and burning and overgrazing for 8,000 years in this age called agriculture. This is when we were overgrazing land and creating mass desertification, putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere thousands of years before we started burning fossil fuels. So this is called the early Anthropocene hypothesis for that reason. Only in the last orange area is where we've burned fossil fuels and have industrialized animal agriculture. And we've thrown things completely out of whack. We didn't know about climate change 8,000 years ago, but our bad behavior on paper seems to have eliminated an ice age. The blue line is the line in which an ice age would have started, and the orange line is the projected path according to science based on ice cores and aberrations, that movements of the sun. So we have, with our bad behavior, eliminated an ice age. No less than that. That is a powerful force. Strange that William Redeman makes these observations, but doesn't follow through on the most important aspect of it, which is that area of yellow. Carbon taken out of the ground and put in the atmosphere by agriculture is bigger. A is bigger than B, the damage we've done to the atmosphere in the last 350 years. So that's a clue that putting carbon back into the soil is a very handy tool. And of course, we don't really see any initiatives in that direction thus far with climate change mitigation. Agriculture seems to be a point of debate when it shouldn't be. We should be immediately mobilizing on activities to mitigate emissions from animal agriculture. In fact, Dr. Rao insists that humanity isn't at all separated from nature, and that we're waking up to our role as the thermostat species. Doughnut economics provides the fine-tuning mechanism between the human invention of economy that always seems to thwart efforts on the environmental stage. It's always environmental reasons why we can't stop climate change. There's money to be made. There's jobs that need to be created in order for political figures to remain in office. So that's the meaning behind this graphic, which combines the economic donut graph with a household climate control thermostat. So, donut economics is a concept invented by Kate Raworth, an economist in the UK of such note. She works for both Oxford and Cambridge. And her TED Talk in 2018 was called "A Healthy Economy Should Be Designed to Thrive, Not Grow." A not growing economy? This idea that we can't have infinite growth in our economy in a clearly finite world, well, this isn't a new idea. It's just one that has had a hard time getting air in the mainstream, even at global conferences like the COP summits. Growth and consumption are largely synonymous in this context. And Kate Raworth has managed to challenge the normativity of economic growth in a way that has generated a lot of excitement amongst environmental and global justice advocates. So do check out that TED Talk. All these ideas originated in a 2017 book called Doughnut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. Kate Raworth said that the donut economics are the only donut that's good for us. But she doesn't know that a vegan donut is high in compassion, which makes it lower in calories from sugar and fat. This is only the beginning of how vegan donut economics differs. The reason that donut economics brings a depth of reality to any conversation about economics, environmentalism, global justice, and inequality gaps at every level of society is that holds the spectrum of cause and effect simultaneously. The outside of the donut and the inside of the donut are two separate pressures and define our safe action in the middle. Is our economic understanding handed down from Adam Smith, founded on a complete exoneration of profiteers for the external cost to nature and the less advantaged? Yes. Can climate change experts in the Northern Hemisphere be completely heartless and come up with hardline solutions that would cripple development in the global South? Yes. Statistics can reveal what seem obvious and absolute solutions. Note that Raworth is aware of this. The SDGs assume endless growth. We haven't yet the opportunity to engage with her in discussion, but it seems she may support Climate Healer's agenda to eliminate SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and that forever upwards graph icon that represents it. Any solution that anyone finds to strive to solve an SDG must be measured against what she calls the ecological ceiling based on the 9 planetary boundaries. A simple example of this is the intentional burning of the Amazon must stop. We have to stop burning the Amazon, obviously. But even if expanding farming and ranching creates job opportunities for Brazilian farm workers. And think about that for a minute, just to sidebar. Can you imagine being a poor Brazilian farmer being lectured on slash and burn of natural forests by nations who denuded their national forests as they built their economies over the past 300 years? Compare the light green agriculture with the dark forest in this satellite imagery. Missouri is the eastern edge of the Great Plains. What if we legitimize our anti-burning outcry with initiatives to rewild America with forests and natural grassland? That dark green back there, that's carbon. And we can see how much of it we've removed, especially in eastern United States. And there's a lot more carbon in natural grasslands than there are in rangelands for animal agriculture. So there's lots of new charts that plot the SDGs to the donut economics. And this one was made by the Stockholm Resilience Center, whose director, Johan Rockström. Been following him for many years, and was Richard Oppenlander who put me onto the 9 planetary boundaries. The radial chart is based on a research paper co-authored by 23 or 24 different top natural scientists, including Johan Rockström and Paul Crutzen. Pictured on the right is a Dutch atmospheric chemist who popularized the phrase Anthropocene to characterize this geological epoch. And as I mentioned earlier, even the objectives of the SDGs in the bottom rung of the biosphere, I consider them anthropocentric. Fish are animals, not resources. Trees are forests, not forestry. Sanitation is an objective by default because the natural state of water is clean, and the rest of the animal kingdom managed to do their business without it becoming a problem. Jan Rockström is also chairman of the EAT Advisory Board, the EAT, which hosts the Animal Eat Forum, and is a co-author of the Eat Lancet Diet with Dr. Walter Willett, probably the most cited nutrition expert in the world. And he's not a big fan of dairy, so hopefully influence our dietary guidelines for Americans. There are people who are constantly evaluating global food security and idealizing what people should be eating, and therefore what production should be done in their benefit at these conferences. And they generally resist vegan messaging. Another co-author on the paper Behind the 9 Planetary Boundaries is the grandfather of climate change, And I read his book, Storms of My Grandchildren, and it was about how he went to Congress in 1988, tried to convince them that climate change was a problem. Of course, at that time, it was 100% about fossil fuels and smoke coming out of smokestack. The smoke going into the sky is an easier to understand form of pollution. So maybe it was understandable in 1988 that animal agriculture wasn't part of the main story. But since then, Dr. Hansen has told Supreme Master TV that going vegetarian is the best way for an individual to fight climate change. Strangely, it's the only place where I've ever seen him say that. I think he was just genuinely telling the truth at the time. And since then, it's become a political problem to associate any sort of mainstream climate change activism with food solutions. Food is obviously very political. But I want to repeat something that he said in the book. I decided that I didn't want my grandchildren to say, Opa understood what was happening, but he didn't make it clear. Interesting parallel here with Sailesh Rao and his granddaughter, whom he's made a pinky promise to always tell the truth. And I think there's methane science in particular that we need to tell the truth about. And I really did discover this through reading Storms of My Grandchildren. He was talking about the Faustian bargain of combustion putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's also putting aerosols, which block a certain amount of solar radiation from entering the atmosphere. He said in the book, we have to worry about that at some point, fossil fuels will run out, or people will get fed up with increased air pollution and decide to clean up particulate pollution. Then, because greenhouse gas remains in the air for centuries and aerosol falls out within days after the aerosol emissions stop, the payment via rapid increase of global warming will come due. Now, this means that he recognizes that a sudden abrupt stop of fossil fuel combustion will actually cause the planet to heat. This is the Faustian bargain. We need to stop burning of fossil fuels, but at the same time, the process of doing so is going to cause the temperature to go up. That's a problem that pretty much every climate scientist knows about, but we don't really have any solutions for it. Now let's take a look at that 9 planetary boundaries graph from an article where they've added a little bit of an extra feature to the graph. The dotted shaded area, you'll know from the legend, is the role of agriculture. I call these the 9 ways to die. It's not quite accurate. It's more of a 9 interrelated sectors of environmental concern that scientists understand to different degrees and have created measures past which the red is beyond the zone of uncertainty. And the dotted area is the role of agriculture. That's been added by this particular paper that wanted to explore all the different measures of how much is agriculture and how much is fossil fuels. And you can see that it affects heavily several of the planetary boundaries. The one with climate change, it shows just a little bit. Dr. Rao's position paper would say that this would actually be 87%. So we'd see even more of this area being shaded. But when you get into arguments with people about impacts of animal agriculture on climate change, they often forget that there's all sorts of other environmental impacts that animals have. And when you take a full accounting of all these impacts, it's really hard to justify feeding any significant population of our planet this way. And if they are being fed, it's probably going to be a rich elite few that can afford, if we're taking a true accounting and subsidizing food that's healthy, subsidizing food that's regenerative and good for the planet. Animal agriculture doesn't have any good news on the horizon. One of the categories that isn't being included here is the atmospheric aerosol loading. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's a question mark because they don't know exactly how to calculate this. But animal agriculture doesn't seem to be much of an effect on that side at all. It's about burning fossil fuels and soot and sulfur from combustion. So this actually draws attention to the fact that eliminating animal agriculture won't be a factor in this aerosol dilemma that we have, the Faustian bargain. Do climate scientists understand this? Absolutely they do. This would be like textbook stuff from the 1990s. Yet, how much does it enter our climate change conversation? Very little at all. One might ask why that is. These are people that are dedicated to fighting climate change and getting the parts per million down to 350. So why wouldn't they be looking at all these different solutions? And the interesting answer is that these people who say leave the science to the scientists are doing a lot of politics. And you think that politics should be left to politicians. And to be fair, a lot of the scientists are being influenced by politicians and being told how much they're allowed to say. But at the same time, I believe that the mainstream scientific community has been so determined that the solution is renewable energy that they don't want to hear anything else. They don't want to hear about animal agriculture, everything else other than a renewable energy grid, and all effort and all donations and all energy being put into a renewable energy grid is just a distraction from their cause. Not a really good stance for a well-rounded environmentalist to make. We should be using all solutions. Quite often there's a straw man argument that vegans think that veganism solves everything, so it's just vegan propaganda. So you don't really have to look in this direction. Don't pay any more attention. It's just vegans being vegans. Everybody move on and eat a little bit less meat. We know meat has an impact, so we'll eat a little bit less. So this less meat argument has largely come out after the documentary Cowspiracy. So we're living in a post-Cowspiracy world, but a lot of it hasn't changed an awful lot. Veganism itself is inherently a bias, and we have to acknowledge that. As vegans, we're often treated like anything that we say must be a self-serving conspiracy theory. Since we're associating with sentimental ethics that lead to a lifestyle forbidden from culinary joy, many brains just switch off, assuming anything that comes out of our mouths is propaganda for everyone to stop eating our animal friends. Well, it's pretty basic psychology to recognize that meat eating culture has a bias too. Certainly an equal bias in the opposite direction, and a much more dangerous bias, as it's blindly understood, not as a bias, but as a law of nature. We eat meat because we eat meat. 36 million years of primate evolution did not result in the perfect apex predator, but one that learned to sharpen sticks and light fires against its predators and assumes the dangerous place atop the food web. Anyone familiar with Dr. Melanie Joy's concept of carnism understands the dedicated logic: we eat meat because we eat meat. This clouds the judgment of most of our societies, including the scientific and environmental communities. Veganism is not an invisible bias because everybody's painfully aware of it. We're constantly reminded with passive-aggressive jokes or rebukes. How can you tell when someone is vegan? Don't worry, they'll tell you. The best response to this attempt to suppress the vegan voice is to steer into it. Start a conversation about your vegan purchases whenever you're in line with the cashier. We're constantly told as vegans that we have to go with the science. So let's figure out what the scientific method is and see if our bias is affected or not, because bias is a very relevant point of interest in the scientific method repeatedly, because it's a looping cycle and you have to test the bias frequently. There's pre-study bias. That could be that the wrong person is doing the experiment. It's a lack of qualification or a mindset that will continuously or subconsciously skew observations, data, and accounting methods to arrive at an anticipated result, or worse, a desired result. A good researcher must continually check for biases during the study, especially at a time when the evidence is analyzed to support or refute the hypothesis. And then obviously post-study bias is when the desired conclusion is observed and no further examination is made. We found what we were looking for. Let's go, move on. Either by their scientists or by other peers that should be double checking the science. Let's stop before we discover anything contrary. And there's many legitimate reasons why there's biases in science. There's a lot of different things that affect humans. We're fallible creatures and we're not perfect. But there's also a lot of very intentional bias. One of them is called a funding bias. It's a conundrum of science that decisions to do the scientific research in the first place have to be funded by interest groups. And that in itself is a highly suspect funding bias. Who wants to know something about science? Well, somebody's usually got something to profit from it. A 2007 study showed that researchers were 4 to 8 times more likely to show positive health effects towards the industry that funded it. Soon after, Marion Nestle writes in her book, Food Politics, How the Food Industry Influenced Nutrition and Health. In the book, she says she wants to create a firewall between funders and scientists, but it's a hard process to enforce. And it's gotten worse. A study in 2018 discovered that commercial implications have shifted to the overall research agenda of the scientific community, away from serving public health priorities. So in other words, this is an unwritten warning to researchers who depend upon research grants to associate with science that goes against the industrial interests. Say something bad about an industry and you may discover that you need money from them at some point in the future. Confirmation bias is the phenomenon where we see what we want to see. It is fair to say that vegans have to be very careful because there is a cascading effect when we discover that eating animals is responsible for chronic diseases and obesity epidemic and climate change and global depletion and desertification and zoonotic diseases and the potential cultivation of the antibiotic superflu that could end the human race. Going vegan seems like a win-win to the power of 10. The Sanskrit word for war means to acquire someone else's cattle. So we might even feel qualified to throw world peace on the side effects of veganism. And why not? I think it's easy enough to illustrate modern animal agriculture as a colonial export and therefore a tool of oppression. I mentioned earlier, once you take off the meat goggles, you start to see the world in a different way. And I see veganism as a way of stepping out of the status quo. There's a status quo of we eat meat because we eat meat. So once you stop doing that, you have in some small way become an activist. You have stepped out of the status quo, and that's the only way that you can turn around and look at the status quo. You don't get a good view of the house when you're inside. So once you get out and you take a look at how animals are treated, a lot of other things click into place too. A lot of systemic oppression becomes very clear, and very much of how much our society, and I don't think you could have a slideshow without this little cartoon, the big lineup for comforting lies, but the guy with unpleasant truths is sitting there bored. So nobody's interested. So how does the vegan lens turn this donut economics into a vegan donut? My research always leads to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And we know the IPCC is a part of the United Nations. When An Inconvenient Truth came out in 2006, the FAO published Livestock's Long Shadow in late 2006. It's kind of hard not to see the huge popularity of that documentary and the surge of interest in climate change, even though it was all focused on fossil fuels, that it wouldn't eventually switch over to what are the other causes of climate change. So the FAO, who have agriculture in their name, decided that they would be the authority, and they have been ever since. However, this is the reason why I've brought up this idea of bias. Are they a biased organization? First of all, are they a climate change organization? No, they're not. People who wrote Livestock's Long Shadow, I've looked into their credentials before then, and they are agronomists. They're agroeconomists. They are economists who turn animals and plants into money. That is what an agronomist is. So this should set off the warning bells right away, that we're talking about people whose desire is to grow the economy, and animals are tools to do so. We're trusting them with the science. That doesn't mean that their science is wrong. It means that their accounting methods come to determine the important data, and they may not be the best people to do that. The funding agency of the FAO is a CGIAR, and they handle a lot of aid money from different countries that are donated to sustainable development goals. I found this on their website. It's not there anymore. But it was profound to me that their priorities in order are reduce poverty, improve food and nutrition security, and improve natural resources and ecosystem services. So anything that reduces poverty, improves food and nutrition security, can then be determined whether it improves natural resources. So the environment comes third. If you go to the FAO website, they define themselves as a hunger organization. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a noble goal to try to get people out of hunger. I described earlier that Food Healers wants to solve SDG number 2, end hunger. But that is an anthropocentric cause. That is an inside of the donut concern. And when animals are your tools, then why is that not a bias that people have recognized? The IPCC is a separate body, and they seem to have accepted this independently published papers from the FAO and have allowed them to be the authority. But there's some question there. I'm not sure why people would trust this process when a lot of times these experts have livestock on their business card. There's a department of the CGIAR called the International Livestock Research Institute. Of course, if you've watched Cowspiracy, you know that there's a debate about whether it was 18% or 51% of greenhouse gases attributed to animal agriculture. Robert Goodland and Jeff Anhang published that it should be at least 51%. It's not 51% exactly. They were essentially saying, go back and do the math. We got at least half. And instead of coming up with something higher, they came up with something lower, fixing one of their rookie mistakes. It was a balancing error and in correcting it, lowered it to 14.5%. And I got to tell the vegan community that this adherence to this science, to say that this is the accurate science, this is the prevailing science, I don't think we have to. If the scientific method were to remove bias, these are not substantiated numbers. In 2014, there was the fifth assessment report. And in it, they said, if you use global warming potential over 100 years, you're checking the impact of a gas over 100 years. This doesn't make any sense because methane is only in the atmosphere for 20 years. It's got a half-life of about 8 years. So this is a method that the IPCC itself has said is obsolete. They've said that in 2014. So what's happening? Why has the FAO not gone back and recalculated with a more appropriate global warming potential period? And this is one of the things that Dr. Sailesh Rao has recalculated with the 20-year period. But there's maybe an argument to use global warming period of 10 years because we want to solve the climate problem in the next 10 years. We don't want to kick it down the road as politicians often do. Just going to move back to a previous slide. So we understand this is the outside of the vegan donut. I would like to offer the floor to comments on anything that I've talked about.
Great presentation. I just wanted to ask about the current pandemic crisis. A lot of people don't have the time or the energy or the insight to think of all of these things. So how do we reach critical mass? How do we simplify it so that people can A, understand it, and B, give them some actionable steps to implement it?
That's a really good point because the IPCC has generated science for policymakers. And that's generally how it happens, is that the government says, we need to find out about this climate change thing. Is it real? So they get a bunch of scientists to answer the question, oh yeah, it's real. So then they publish the results to policymakers. So it's an intergovernmental panel of climate change because in the 80s, Ronald Reagan made sure that it was. There was independent scientific research done before that. But when they created this body, the Reagan administration said, okay, so we don't want climate scientists just saying stuff, doing research and coming up with conclusions. Let's make it an intergovernmental hybrid so that the governments can ask questions and the scientists can do the science, and then they can publish the science and weed out anything that may be harmful to our economy, our economic plans. And it's very easy to draw a line from that to why they just don't want to touch animal agriculture. How does a politician say, yes, please, I want to tell my voters how to eat? You know, there would be cries of nanny state. And the problem being that everything in the climate change forum seems to think that we're going to solve this through the government. And really, to get a renewable energy grid, you do need the cooperation of the government. To get a vegan society, we don't need the government at all. It would be really nice if they helped. And it's very telling that they don't help, that they don't say anything about things that would damage their industry. They don't help because they think that a vegan world is so unreasonable and unlikely. They obviously fear it. Otherwise, say it. Why not? Right? So I think that what we need is science for people to make decisions for themselves and not have it filtered through this process. The graph shows what the IPCC publishes, starts with the government and then goes to the scientists and then goes to the policymakers to decide what can be published. And I also find it interesting that the FAO publishes independently. When it comes to agriculture, they let them publish outside of this framework, and that's considered the authority. They didn't even follow their own rules. I think it all comes down to this idea that any industry is absolved of its pollution. There's externalities that aren't recognized. And when you don't recognize those externalities, then meat is cheap, then oil is cheap. If cleanup is always somebody else's problem, then we can't really solve any of these problems because we have cheap meat in America. What else are we going to eat? I think science for people is really the answer that hopefully we can get that through to the mainstream. And unfortunately, I'm a media guy. I know that they won't want to tell the truth about animal agriculture because their sponsors are selling burgers and cheese. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I was thinking about get the thought process going because I'm a vegan, but I don't have that time to call my representative, get on the phone, go out, protest, just trying to make it through the end of the day, day by day. I was looking for some easy steps. And I know there are no easy solutions. Okay, do this, do that. You have half an hour to work on this stuff. this is the action steps.
Yeah, it's funny. Before I was vegan, I was completely trusting that the political system will eventually come to the right conclusions, that they will solve everything that needs to be solved. And now I've discovered that they won't. Dr. Rao's opening keynote for this conference, he talked about if we wait for them, we are extinct. So we have to convince people that it's not the government that's going to solve our problems. I think the Trump administration helped in that respect. When he came into office and said that they're pulling out of the Paris Accord, I said, well, I guess it's up to individuals now. The activism has to grow because we're not going to get any policies whatsoever, right? So you're either chasing policies to fix the world or you're fixing the world yourself. So I think it's really come down to us, and we have to be waking everybody up to that reality.